Okay, well, today we have a guest, Dr. Bryce Dietrich of Purdue University in Indiana, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about his recent paper on racial avoidance and walking behavior, specifically to focus on the really intriguing and innovative methods he used to conduct this research. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Dietrich.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about the paper, and I appreciate having the opportunity.
So if we could, I'd like to start these a little bit broader and just ask you, as a researcher in political science, but a field that will study intergroup relations, what are the big picture questions that guide your work?
So I like to think of, so specifically with respect to intergroup relations, I've been motivated by this idea of people moving in space. So I really like this concept of thinking about intergroup relations in 3 dimensions, and what does that mean politically when people either avoid one another or get closer to one another. And so the paper that we're talking about today is kind of the culmination of this research interest that I developed a very long time ago in grad school. The other area of interest that I have is in terms of kind of nonverbal cues with respect to speech making. So that's certainly not, I have not applied that to intergroup relationships per se, but certainly those are in the same area, because our argument is that interpersonal avoidance on city sidewalks is a form of nonverbal behavior in terms of how those cues impact the person that you're avoiding and vice versa. Yeah, and so I'm happy to provide more details, but that's like the 30,000 foot overview of my research story, if you will.
Okay, yeah, so you took it right out of my mouth. Yeah, clearly this specific paper touches very much on issues related to people moving through space, but also on nonverbal cues. So can you just give us a little bit of more background on how you became interested in this specific topic? Was there a eureka moment? Is this something that's been sitting with you for a long time about how to actually run a study in the real world about how people walk down a street?
Yeah, so it was actually kind of a right place, right time sort of moment. So when I was in grad school, we had this thing called the quad cam, which was this camera that used to be pretty invasive. So it used to be that you could control this camera on top of the Union and like zoom it in and zoom out. They got rid of that functionality. Now it just kind of sits on top of the Union and watches what is called the quad at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And I was just fascinated by the footage because it would be going 24/7, and you could see these kind of dense social scenes kind of unfolding in real time. And so when I was in grad school, I became really interested in thinking about the best ways to analyze that as a social scientist and try to get inference in terms of the types of processes that we're observing within these complex scenes. And so my initial dissertation proposal had 2 components to it. One was based on vocal pitch in the US Congress and how that is a form of emotionality. What does that mean for bill advocacy? But I also had this other section of the proposal that was about members of Congress mingling on C-SPAN. At the time, they told me to choose one, and the members of Congress mingling on C-SPAN paper was just going to be a lot more challenging to do from a data collection standpoint. So I kind of set that aside and focused on vocal pitch initially. During the process of working on that, I was still interested in using that types of footage, and I stumbled across traffic camera networks in cities like New York, and I was like, this is just like what we had in the University of Illinois, but it is all over the city of New York and also globally. I mean, these traffic camera networks, London, for example, has a really extensive traffic camera network, and so it got me reinvigorated to explore how to understand interpersonal or intergroup dynamics within these settings. And I just happened to be working with Ryan Enos at the time, who's a professor at Harvard in political science. He and I were working with Maya Sen, who's also a professor at Harvard in political science, on a paper dealing with vocal pitch in the Supreme Court. And I saw Ryan give this talk at APSA, the American Political Science Association's annual meeting, about an experiment that he was doing where he was kind of mixing how students would sit in a classroom setting to understand kind of intergroup dynamics. and that jogged my memory about all of these exciting things that I wanted to do with traffic cameras. So I contacted Ryan and I said, hey, we should work on a paper that deals with traffic camera footage. Here's this really interesting feed that you can look at right now. And so at the time, one of his students, Melissa Sands, was wrapping up a dissertation, part of which ended up also being in nature human behavior, in which she did the sidewalk experiment in Boston, where she randomly placed a Confederate who is either phenotypically black or phenotypically white and dressed in either attire that was like consistent with somebody being of lower or higher socioeconomic status. And then after she randomly placed this individual on the sidewalks, immediately afterwards, she would have a survey ready for pedestrians to answer related to redistributive wealth. I think it was related to a tax policy, if I'm not mistaken, in Boston. And so she found that there wasn't a large effect in terms of the racial dynamic of the treatment, but she did find an effect with respect to the type of attire that the individual was wearing. And so Ryan said, "Oh man, you need to talk to Melissa because she's already really interested in doing work on sidewalks already." And so Melissa and I started talking, and then slowly but surely we developed this study after our common interest in kind of intergroup dynamics, but also this idea of traffic camera networks as being a useful data resource. And so yeah, that is the roundabout origin of the project. And so now we're just generally excited about doing this work moving forward as well. And so we certainly have some ideas with that regard as well.
Yeah, that's so cool that you have this kind of interesting thing that you notice, this quad cam, and it kind of sits in the back of your mind, and then it erupts, becomes non-dormant years later when you realize, hey, you can actually kind of study this. And so that really does lead me to my next question. I'm a social psychologist. Mostly what I do is kind of tightly controlled laboratory studies or online studies. And I'm always so impressed by people who can bring this stuff out into the field. And in the little bit of research I've done out in the field, I'm always surprised every single time about all the things that you have to consider in order to run good field studies. So does anything come to the top of your mind actually completing the study, hiring the actors, setting them up during the right time of day, resetting them so you have a clean run that you were like, man, I never thought I'd have to deal with this type of issue when I first set out doing this, and now I really have to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that first, as a political methodologist, I would say that I get most excited about the problem solving aspect of research. And so this type of project really did scratch that itch, because at every stage in the project, there was kind of not necessarily a fire that needed to be put out, but another issue that we had to deal with. So the first is just the logistics of what we were trying to accomplish, which is hiring the actors or finding people to participate in the study. That was actually one of the more easier sections of the research. But once we selected the individuals, we selected the street corners that we had to do that we wanted to do with the experiment. The street corners that we selected were partially due on what we knew about census block data, because we wanted to try to randomly vary based on whether or not the neighborhood was racially diverse or not. But it was also based on just where the cameras are positioned. So we also had to take into consideration whether or not the camera had a reasonable angle for capturing the sidewalk, because a lot of traffic cameras are focusing on the roads, obviously, and only some of them focus on sidewalks. And so we also had to take that into consideration. So we had a big scouting trip to New York where my co-author Melissa Sands went and looked at these cameras on the ground and so forth and so on. So once we had all of that selected, on the day of the experiment, I essentially set up a script at the University of Iowa, which is where I was when I did the study, that essentially recorded these camera feeds 24/7 as the experiment was happening in real time. And so we were caching all these images simultaneously. The biggest challenge in terms of our hypothesis was that we had hypotheses that were related to the demographic characteristics of the pedestrians. So initially we thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll just get the video, and then we'll have somebody afterwards watch the video and just label the demographics of the pedestrians. And so for one of the camera locations, that was feasible given the angle of the camera, and the other camera location, it was actually really hard to do that. And so when we were thinking about this problem, I came up with this idea of, well, they can just narrate the race of individuals or the demographic characteristics of the pedestrians in real time as the experiment is unfolding. And so we had a separate RA essentially watch where our Confederates were on the sidewalk and essentially narrate the demographic characteristics of each pedestrian. So they would say, you see this guy in a hat, he looks like he's Caucasian, maybe mid 40s, so forth and so on. So there was these different demographic characteristics. We did that on the ground. Within the first hour, we realized that that was not tenable for all demographic characteristics. And so we paused after the first block and reset the labeling of the demographic characteristics. And we only made it a binary question about whether or not our research assistant thought the individual was phenotypically Black. Because that most of our hypotheses centered on Black pedestrians versus white pedestrians predominantly. And so we said, well, we'll just assume that if they're non-Black, then they're going to have a higher probability of being phenotypically white in this instance. And so once we did that, the person was really able to kind of in real time narrate how these individuals, the demographic characteristics of the pedestrians. And so if we were to do it again on a sidewalk, I think that type of design would be very feasible, but you would have to have an RA assigned to each demographic category. And then the way that we sync that with the video is that we essentially had a screen recording similar to this going that had the camera feed going on one side of the screen. And then I just had them call in with their cell phone onto my computer and then just record the FaceTime or the Apple audio on top of the video. And it actually worked really well in that regard. But like I said, I think if we were to do it again, we would have multiple different RAs all assigned to each demographic category. The last hurdle, it's not really a hurdle, but it's one of the challenges of dealing with field experiments is that, so our research design was really sound in terms of the heterogeneity or the diversity of the sidewalk. We used census block data. We selected two polar opposites in terms of census block, in terms of the racial composition of the sidewalks. But in practice, the sidewalks, once we started to annotate the race of the pedestrians, for the most part, they were very similar. Like there were not stark differences in terms of the racial composition of the sidewalks. And so in hindsight, if we were to, again, to do another version of this, like the best way to assess sidewalk characteristics is probably do an initial preliminary study where you just put people out in the field and they just annotate the composition of the demographic characteristics that you care about when making the initial selection of which sidewalk to place it on. Obviously, that increases the money of the study, but I think that's a better, in hindsight, that would have been a better way to capture the characteristics.
Yeah, there was a lot of interesting information there. I think it just really highlights that when you are running these types of studies, it's never set in stone. You have to stay flexible and you have to be weighing the costs and benefits of, well, what do I really need to get on my research question and what's feasible? What am I willing to sacrifice? So going back to your, simplifying the question, is this person phenotypically Black or not? I'm sure in an ideal world, you want more fine-grained information than that, but you kind of had to make that sacrifice because you felt like you could still get useful information out of that while actually running the study. So I think that was well captured there. Jumping ahead a little bit to your results, I think that you found with some variability, on average, people tended to walk about 4 inches away from the Black than the white Confederate. And there's one reading of this paper that I don't agree with, but 4 inches, it's not even a full half Subway sandwich. What is it that we care about for 4 inches? Why could something like a 4-inch difference in terms of where you choose to walk for a Black versus a white person on the street have a real impact on people's lives? So I want to give you, the expert, the chance to articulate why you think that this is a meaningful effect.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, and then I will, and then I'll talk about kind of our new research design that we've developed to deal with this precise issue. So the first thing I would say is that, so we did a write-up for Harvard's Kennedy School. They have this thing called the Journalist Resource, where that's an online publication where they highlight new research. And so in the interview for that, my co-author, Melissa Sands, had a really good point with respect to this exact question, which is So if you're the one experiencing avoidance that is race-based, 4 inches, maybe the first time it happens, maybe you don't necessarily notice it that much. But if you had to experience that 4 inch avoidance over the course of your whole life, that starts to have a collective cumulative effect on how people uh, understand themselves vis-a-vis one another. So yes, on its face, it doesn't seem like it may not necessarily be all that much of a treatment effect. But if you think about it over the course of a lifetime, it really does start adding up. And if you talk to people who experience this, and so when I presented this work in other studies and other settings, when I presented at the University of Iowa, for example, I had a student of color who was in the audience who was just interested in the topic. She was an undergrad, and she said, I experience this every day on the Iowa City bus. Like literally, when I'm on the bus, nobody sits next to me. People always sit in other seats. And that type of treatment effect, if it's a single seat, would not seem very much in quantitative terms. But for the person who's experienced it, it really does have an effect on their perceptions of self as well as just their understanding of these race-based dynamics. So the way that we're trying to approach this now, or at least what we're experimenting with in the near future, is we're replicating the study in a virtual reality setting, in which we've created a virtual sidewalk. We've created Confederates that look similar to the folks that we used in our original study that are placed on this sidewalk. And so in a virtual reality setting, there's trade-offs as well, just as you have an experimental and a field experiment. So unlike a field experiment, in a VR setting, people know that they're in the simulation, so it's not necessarily as evocative as what you would get on an everyday encounter within a street corner. So there's that concern. But the benefit of a VR setting is that first, it makes it a lot easier to estimate things like the position of individuals vis-a-vis one another. So in the paper, and I'd be happy to go into this in more detail, but in the paper, we talk about how when you're trying to infer a three-dimensional treatment using a two-dimensional image, that's actually a really hard problem in a world where you don't have access to the camera, because you don't know the lens that it's using, you don't know the angle of the camera, you don't know the zoom rate, all of which are necessary in order to back out that three-dimensional mapping from a 2D image. So we create a measurement strategy in the paper that we validate using a three-dimensional rendering of the experiment in an agent-based model, which I'm happy to talk about that. But in a VR setting, you don't have to worry about that because in the VR setting the exact distance for individuals are in their exact paths, which is much more challenging in a field experiment. The other thing in the VR setting is that you can actually control to the person what is like the demographic variation that you have on the sidewalk, which again is not something that you get in a field experiment. And so we're really excited to see whether or not we can replicate this result in that setting. And then, so experiment 1 is just going to be replicating the result in a virtual reality setting. Experiment 2 gets at the heart of this question, which is that we're going to take the tracking data from experiment 1 in VR and essentially invert the experiment. So instead of the participants being the individuals walking down the sidewalks, instead what the participants are going to be is the individuals standing in those locations having a conversation. And what they're going to observe is the tracking behavior of people who participate in experiment 1. And we're going to ask them questions about how they respond to that type of behavior. Because one of the things that they found in VR that is actually really powerful is that in VR, you're able to inhabit the bodies of different individuals. So things like empathy is very, you can trigger this response a lot in a VR setting because you can put somebody in the body of somebody else and you can have them understand those characteristics and observe these types of behaviors. And so that's the second half of the study, is to show that, okay, what happens when people experience racial avoidance in this virtual setting? How does that impact their ability or their perceptions of self, et cetera? But again, it's in virtual reality, so there's certainly trade-offs with that in that respect as well.
Yeah, I like what you touched on there in terms of maybe first, now you're actually usually you see the reverse in lab and then to the field, and now you're starting with this really intriguing real world finding in the field, and then can we bring it in the lab to gain maybe some additional control and leverage new technologies like virtual reality to get at some of these more psychological questions of, what are the psychological effects of experiencing racial avoidance? It sounds like 4 inches, but if it's with you your whole life, you can imagine how that could have a snowball effect that's really corrosive. And you start hurting your own self-esteem or hurting your own sense of belonging, and that can have all these negative downstream consequences. So you will just have to come back in a few years once you've mastered VR technology. My students should know that in a few months, we'll be have a lecture about experiencing discrimination where we use one of these VR studies. And you'll have to tell us more about that. But thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Dietrich, and I really appreciate you talking with me.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been fantastic.